Whoop, there we go. Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute coming to you live today from the beautiful, sunny city of Calgary. And I happen to be in a building that was purpose-built, that my colleagues from Calgary reminded me, purpose-built to be adapted to not only include parking, but also to include different kinds of multi-purpose space, including where I am, where there's a conference going on that I'm speaking at, and then a bunch of side rooms and things. And so it's tremendous to be here. I'm going to ask my panelists to expose their screens and put them on so you can see they're waiting there to come on, and to acknowledge, obviously, the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that Calgary is a very rich city with all sorts of interesting history and evolution and phases of development. Most importantly, its ancestral communities that were founded here. It is part of Treaty 7, which include the Piikani, the Kainai, the Siksika, the Tsuut'ina, the Bearpaw, the Wesley, and the Chiniki First Nations of the Stoney Nakoda Nation. It's also the territory of the Métis Nation 3 in the southern region of Alberta. And the acknowledgement there in terms of the Aboriginal First Nations Indigenous history here is also reflected, as you can see, in the actual urban farm, which I happen to be looking at through the edge of this platform building. And I'm really, really pleased to have, it's just coincidence that we're having this session, that I happen to be in Calgary, and that two of our panelists are recently former politicians, elected officials on council here in Calgary. So it's all about Calgary today, and that's tremendous. And we also have Kate Graham with us from the University of Western Ontario, no stranger to municipal politics and provincial politics, incidentally, in London. And then Tennille Bonagore, who said to me in the prep that to pronounce her name, just think of Bono and Al Gore together, Bonagore. So from Waterloo. So if you guys can put your screens on, then everybody will see each other, and we'll get a chance to talk about this topic, which you can see we asked with a certain tongue in cheek. Why would anyone run for municipal office? 2/3 of Canadians go to a municipal poll this month. I think it's mostly all in October, to decide to cast a vote or votes for local council reps and for mayors. And as we know, it will, Kate, you can reinforce with me if this is true. I'll come to you first, but we know that it will be probably the lowest turnout that we get in any election process in Canada, tends to be at the municipal level, but I want you to confirm or deny that for me, Kate. And we also know that through the pandemic, if there's ever been a moment where people would be, we hope, more aware of the importance of their local representation and the importance of local government in terms of delivering them the services and programs that we became so viscerally aware we needed during the pandemic. So maybe that will mean we'll get more people turning out to the polls this fall. I don't know, but we wanted to get a chance to talk to folks who have been in the trenches. Some of you still there, I think, for another month, Tennille, you said, and others that have stepped out more recently. Let's talk a bit about why would anybody run for municipally elected office. And I'll mute myself so that you don't get too much background noise, obviously. Yeah. And Kate, I'm going to go to you first in London. I'm assuming you're in London, Ontario today. You're to give us a bit of an overview about what your analysis is telling you. You were a former municipal staff employee and now you're an academic, and you've been in the political world. As I said, you ran provincially. So maybe you can just start us off, and then I'll swing around. And I know the mayor is there somewhere because I saw him briefly come on. He's put his camera off, but we do have Mayor Nenshi and Councillor Farrell and Councillor Bonagore with us. So go ahead, Kate, first to you.
Sure. Well, it's funny when CUI first advertised this event, I don't know about the other panelists, what your experience was, but my inbox filled with people who said, why would anyone run for municipal office? I've been thinking the same thing. I drive around my community, I see the signs up, and I wonder, I watch what happens to people in these roles, and I think, why would anyone step forward to do that? And I don't know about you, but for me, that is like 5-alarm fire level alarm about the state of our democracy and what the experiences are of the great people who choose to step forward, often have a very genuine desire to serve their community. So, Mary, as you mentioned, there are 800 municipal elections across 5 provinces and territories in the next 3 weeks in Canada. So it's one of those unusual moments where all of these elections coincide, and it provides a phenomenal opportunity for us to take a good look at what's happening with the health of our local democracies. And as you said, I'm in Ontario. I know the Ontario case best. There are a few indicators that suggests that we may have a problem on our hands. So 444 of those elections are in Ontario, and 139 mayors or reeves were acclaimed, meaning no one was willing to run against them. And there are 32 councils where the entire council was acclaimed. We could go community by community and also look at places where there are just far fewer candidates running. I think there's also a gender dimension to this. We see fewer females willing to step forward. In London, where I live, 73% of the candidates are male. We don't have enough of other dimensions of diversity as well. And, maybe that's a post-pandemic hangover where we know the impacts have been uneven and the level of energy that's needed is unevenly there right now because people have struggled so much. We don't know, but I like your optimism that maybe we're about to see a huge turnout and this great awakening that local government matters. But I think we're in for a low turnout across the country. I think we're in for communities really struggling to remind people of what we all know. If you're tuning into this today, local government matters. It's defined by being closest to the people. And yet when we look at some of these key indicators like turnout, like who's running, like what the lived experiences are of the people who step forward, I do think there's lots of reasons that we should be ringing the alarm bells.
Thanks, Kate. Well, I'm flabbergasted that there are 82 councils that were fully acclaimed.
32.
32.
No, concerning. One would be concerning.
Yeah, exactly. One would be concerning, but 32 fully acclaimed and 800. And then, as you suggest, fewer women, fewer candidates overall. I mean, this is just a sorry state, I guess, but nice to see you, Mr. Mayor. You're always a mayor, and once a mayor, always a mayor. Delighted to have you on City Talk again. I think we could go to you next, if you will, just to give us a sense of what your temperature taking is telling you. As you suggest, is it 2/3 of the country, Kate? 800 municipal elections.
It's 5 provinces and territories. Yeah, so 800.
Yeah, so it's an interesting opportunity for a real transition here. And head over to you, and then I'll go to your colleagues from council.
I feel like I'm missing one of those provinces, Kate. You're going to have to fill me in on which of the Atlantic provinces I'm missing on my list, but
PEI, November the 7th.
It's PEI. Thank you. I'm supposed to be in PEI today, as a matter of fact. I was a late addition to this thing because I was supposed to be on a plane on my way to PEI, but apparently they still don't have power all over downtown Charlottetown.
City Talks gain, PEI's loss. We're glad to have you this morning.
Yeah, but I'm thrilled to be here anyway. So why would someone run for municipal office? I mean, Councillor Farrell probably has way more to say about this than I do, as she typically has way more to say than I do, but right, Drew, that's how it works, right? I'm the quiet one.
Never.
I'm the quiet one in the relationship, because now she's running for provincial office, and my question is, why in the world would anyone want to run for provincial office? But look, municipal office is where it's at. We get to work on the issues that are the most interesting. The reason I was a little bit late this morning is because I just got off of a really interesting conversation with mostly federal civil servants. And I was talking about the necessity of centering the citizen in the decisions we make. Too often in government, we center the process or the bureaucracy or the history or the way things have been done. And in Calgary, we worked really hard on moving the citizen to the center of the process. And no one argued with that. It was just, how do we do it, right? Everyone thought that was the right thing to do. And I noticed in talking to these federal civil servants that it's actually kind of an alien concept, because so much of the work they do is so very divorced from reality. And when you look, I shouldn't say reality, it is real, but it's divorced from the reality of people's everyday lives. And when we look at where the federal government is really failing right now, the passport office, airports, so on, these are the very few areas where the federal government actually interacts with citizens directly. And it is really interesting to me that Service Canada is buried in Child, Youth and Families Canada, which is buried in Social Development Canada, and that there's no overall view or focus on service, on citizen service or customer service, if you prefer. And so for me, municipal government is really where we get to interact with people. It's a cliche to say we're closer to the people. I mean, heck, there's twice as many MLAs in Calgary as there are city councillors. So that's not really the case. But what is important is that the work that we do is, in fact, the work that impacts people every day. So, Mary, you've heard me say this many times, but my joke always is, if the federal government disappeared while we were on this webinar, it would probably take us a week or two to notice. If your provincial government disappeared, you know, if you were in school or in the hospital, you'd notice pretty quickly. But if your municipal government disappeared, well, you'd have no roads, no transit, no parks, no green space, no clean water, no 911, no police, no emergency response, no fire department. And you'd notice pretty quickly because you'd be dead. And so the work that we do at the municipal level is what keeps people happy, healthy, and safe every day. And to me, there's nothing better than that. And the last thing I'll say is, man, there's no political parties, which makes life so much better. So I often tease Drew as sort of being kind of one end of the ideological spectrum on our council. And we have folks who are, you know, the Tea Party of Canada, Trumpers on the other side. But more often than not, Councillor Farrell votes with those folks, or sometimes they even do stuff together, because the unshakable Drew Chew alliance she can tell you about. But it's because we're focused on what's right for cities. There really is no right wing or left wing way to plow the streets. There's just an efficient and an inefficient way to plow the streets. And so ultimately, that's what gets me really excited about municipal government. And the way to annoy me the most is if someone says to me, oh, now that you're done being the mayor, are you ready for a bigger political job or a more important political job? There is no bigger or more important political job than the one I was just lucky enough to hold for 11 years. I'll stop there.
It's like this way that we talk about, I always try to correct people when we talk about senior levels of government.
Oh, I just told the civil servants to get the word level of government out of their vocabulary. Yeah. We talk about orders of government. And if you say senior level of government, I'm a very nonviolent man. I'm likely to punch you in the throat.
Yes, exactly. So it's got to be orders of government. And there is an interesting comment that Cameron Charlebois, who happens to be the chair of the COI board, just saying, but he's also a Montrealer, is saying, but there are political parties in Quebec and in Montreal, and there are political parties in Vancouver. So it's not always the case, but I hear you.
But very, very different, right?
Yes.
And I should have said, except for Montreal and the Lower Mainland.
Yes.
But very, very different, because those are not, especially, well, actually in both Montreal, Quebec City, and the Lower Mainland, all three, the parties tend to be parties nowadays of personality. So they're not, you know, it's not liberal versus conservative. And in the Lower Mainland, in Vancouver in particular, it used to be kind of NDP and everybody else, but that has disappeared quite a long time ago. And what we're seeing now is, you know, Kennedy Stewart was elected as mayor of Vancouver as an independent. Now he has his own party, which is basically the Kennedy Stewart party, which probably won't survive him. Vision Vancouver didn't survive when Gregor Robertson stepped down. So there are arguments for, if you want to get really nerdy about it, there are arguments for the organization of city council.
Yeah.
Using explicit parties instead of shadow parties like you have in Toronto.
Yeah.
We can get into that if people want to get all nerded out about it. But in reality, these are not typically partisan things, and we do have the ability to be more thoughtful on our policy making.
Just let you know that CityTalk always has lots of urban nerds, and they're on that chat. So chat away, guys, about whether or not parties are a good idea or not a good idea. And also, as Nahed suggested, they're not like rigid ideological parties. There's sometimes coalitions or different things, but I think it's an interesting question in Ontario at the moment because of the province having brought in strong mayor, what they're calling strong mayor legislation, and whether that will tip the balance. But I want to go to Tennille next to give us a perspective. I mean, you're a journalist, Tennille, and somewhere in there you decided, hey, I'm going to run for elected office. So why on earth did you decide to do it? And I guess we could ask you, why aren't you continuing? And why do you think people should run for elected office? And then Drew, you're going to be cleanup. So go over to you, Tennille, in KW.
Okay, yeah, so I'm in Waterloo, which is on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. So yeah, I'm a news journalist by background. I covered state, national politics, all that kind of stuff. So I like to think, you know, I was pretty jaded before I hit politics, which was a fairly handy thing. But I really entered, I ran for council fueled by my community work, to be honest. I had been involved in environment groups locally. I'd been involved in arts and culture projects. And with the climate crisis, I saw a real need to change, just to set a very clear focus within the city of the direction to go. So I really went with the hope of kind of moving the compass on climate change and equity. Now, I am very, very lucky because Waterloo Council is pretty different from what I hear from other places across Ontario and some across the country. We're a young council, we're majority female. Most of us have young kids, including the male councillors. We come from different backgrounds, but basically all of us share a fairly consistent vision of where we want the city to go. We just disagree sometimes on how to get there. So during this term, we totally moved the needle when it came to climate action, infrastructure funding to better support, climate mitigation. We've created a new equity team within the city. So when I was thinking whether to run again, I had a couple of things to consider, which was, have I done enough in this term? And do I have the energy and capacity to do another 4 years at this level of engagement? And my answer to the second part was no. Like, I had this reckoning with myself, and council's fantastic. It is such a great opportunity. So when you ask why should people run, it's the most impactful way to help shape your community. And as Ned was saying, like, city councils, they touch every part of your life. I like to tell people it's from when you step out your door and walk onto the footpath to catching the bus, whether you have a park, whether your toilet flushes, and whether you can get a glass of water. All of that comes under municipal. So you get to dig into some really gnarly and complex challenges. You get to meet a heap of people, and ultimately you are part of a group that is trying to make the best decisions for the future of the city. And that's a really privileged position to sit in.
So Tennille, why didn't you stay at it?
Well, council is pretty all-consuming. Here in Ontario, it's considered a part-time role. Here in Waterloo, we're paid around $40,000 a year.
Right.
So we're on the lower end of pay when it comes to a city of 130, 150,000 people. And I have a very busy ward. Mine is the uptown heart of the city. I have fantastic residents who are very engaged. I have the urban core with all the businesses and the diversity of that. So this is the nexus of gentrification and climate impact, because it's also the oldest area of the city. So it's kind of, for a policy nerd, it's the most fun seat to have. So I've loved it. But it takes a lot of commitment, and it's not a part-time role. So the way I think of it is council is a fantastic adventure that precludes a lot of other life adventures. Oh,
but you do have lives, you have personal lives, and you want to make priorities. Obviously, pick your priorities. But I'm interested in all of you, and I know Drew is going to come right in and reinforce this. This isn't for the faint of heart, being a municipal councillor, and you are dealing with real issues people experience. I often say to the federal bureaucrats that, if you're a career civil servant within the government of Canada, you and you're mid-level or even quite senior level, you rarely see your minister. You have an appointment, you have an opportunity to brief, and you go across to the other building and you brief the minister. If you're a municipal council member, you're seeing staff on the way to the bathroom every day. So there is a proximity that a council member has to a staff, and that staff have to council members, which has all sorts of positive components to it, but it also has all sorts of other challenges. So Drew, let's go to you next. We were reminiscing, you and I've known you since the beginning of your political career when you were just starting out, and you've just completed. How many terms were you on council here in Calgary?
6 terms, 20 years.
6 terms and 20 years.
I know.
Good for you. Good for you. So why on earth why did you decide to do it? Why did you stay at it for 20 years? And what do you think now? Why do you think it's important that people provide, step up and offer to provide this kind of service? What's your view?
Well, I got involved because I was involved in my community in a really profound way as a community volunteer and activist. And it seemed like a natural step to run for office. And I think you have people run for office for different reasons. Some are interested in power, even though I would say municipal level, you have a limited amount of power, but it does attract a certain type of person. And then there are other people who are there for public service and to truly make the world a better place for the people that you touch. And that's what motivated me. And I stayed because I just continued to find really exhilarating reasons to stay involved and how to change my little part of the world. So it was immensely inspiring and rewarding. I do think, though, when we talk about the phenomenon of why we're not seeing women running and why we're not seeing people from diverse backgrounds running, I think we need to talk about that directly, because it's a phenomenon and it's purposeful. It's a strategy where you develop cynicism through just the bullying that's happening in social media. People, we're seeing it with COVID. It's gotten even more extreme. I know I had to deal with that in a very extreme way. So did I. But that's a strategy to stifle debate. And it's specifically directed toward women and of people of color and people from other marginalized groups. And so how do you counteract that? I think the natural response is to protect yourself and your family and not subject yourself to that kind of abuse. But that would be the wrong approach, because that means that they win. And so confronting it, developing a circle of protective friends and supporters who can shield you from that, limiting your social media. There are ways to strategy to counteract that, but removing women and diverse communities from the political arena, we all lose as a result. And so I think I was always subject to some pretty tough elections. I won them all, but it was because I focused on a vision and positive vision rather than devolve into negativity. I never devolved into negativity. And I know that's why Naheed won against all odds, was because he spoke of a really compelling, positive vision for a city. And don't be afraid to talk about that vision. But the society is becoming cynical because of that negativity. And they're being barraged by a whole host of really awful topics, and people are just naturally shutting down, and they can't consume all this awful stuff, and so they're just removing themselves from the equation, and that's the worst possible outcome. But it is a strategy, and we must figure out a way as a society to counter that strategy. And I would say none of us have the luxury of being a bystander right now. That's why I'm running for another order of government. I never thought that I would do that, but I make a terrible bystander. And I think that we need people to step up who are there for public service, not for power.
I think we need a t-shirt that says, I would make a terrible bystander. That's a fabulous way of you putting it. I mean, once you have the bug of service and you understand you want to provide service, but I am interested. Tennille, I saw you put your hand up. So do you want to talk about the bullying piece? Like, what are we going to do about this? And Kate, I mean, I'll go to Tennille first, and then Kate, I want to hear from Kate, whether we're seeing in the research and the data that social media bullying or other kinds of bullying or lack of civility, is that actually, do we have data to confirm that is deterring people from seeking municipal office? To Tennille,
Well, yeah, it's beyond just the lack of civility. It's actually threats.
Yeah.
just the threats. But sorry, I'll
That's
Yeah,
fine.
no, it's like, so I
Keep your
wanted
mic's
to push
open.
back.
I'm happy for you to jump in. Go ahead,
I
Tania.
just wanted to push back a little bit on some of what Drew was saying. Not to say that she's wrong, but I think there's other aspects to it. Yes, women are treated differently in the discourse from the public, that's for sure. And we see that within the responses that myself and my fellow relatively younger female councillors receive versus the feedback that the men receive, just in the tone. It is different. It is very real. But when it comes to representation, I think just it's interesting here in Waterloo region. So we're a lower tier municipality. So we've got the city and then the region. At the city, there's women running everywhere. It's probably, there are as many women as men, if not more. It's so gender is not it's always, you need to make sure that that stays strong. But in Waterloo, I think there have been so many strong women councillors and strong women that we've had women mayors before, that's been normalised to an extent that as a candidate, that it's kind of not exceptional that there are a lot of women running in Waterloo. The challenge here is in a more holistic representation of the diversity that's within Waterloo. So right now, I'm an Australian Canadian. I am diversity in Waterloo. This does not look like diversity, okay? But I'm about as diverse as it gets for this city council, which it's not the council's fault, but it's up to the voters to bring in new people.
But Tania,
this changes at the regional level, so it's mostly at the region.
You say it's not the council's fault. Let's just talk about that for a second. I mean, the dilemma is that we all function like tribes and clubs, and we do end up self-selecting. So I don't know whether we can let councils off the hook to say it's not the council's fault. It has to be some collective ownership that we take, that we're not for whatever set of complicated reasons, what actions do we need to take to make sure that people from diverse communities, people of color, Indigenous, people coming from different backgrounds, feel comfortable throwing their name into the hat.
Oh yes, I didn't mean that. I meant the makeup of council. Who is elected to council is one of the few things that council cannot control.
Right.
So we don't get to say who sits on council.
Right,
it's
I see.
Voters that get to say that.
But
you're right. So we are working very hard on equity and belonging, because we need people to see themselves at that level. We need people to be welcome at that level. And what we've had is, there is some pretty awful racism that occurs in campaigns in this region, and candidates of color are affected by horrendous reactions and behaviors. But what we've seen in the past is other candidates rallying around and supporting those candidates of color to let them know that they have our support. Like, even if we're running against each other, I'm going to support you and call out that behavior. So we need more of it. We all need to be doing it to get back to, we can't be bystanders. But that's where I think other candidates and other elected representatives, we need to be very vocal in shutting down that kind of racism.
Kate, I was going to go to you next, but I'm going to go to Nahed first. He's put his hand up, and then I'll come to you. So go ahead, Nahed, and then Kate.
There we go. Thanks so much for that. I did want to jump in because I wanted to ask Kate a question as well before you went to her. Thanks for that to both of you. And Tennille, I am shocked that you just self-disclosed as an Australian, because I thought that was a perfect Kitchener, Ontario accent, and you just moved across to Waterloo. So you're hiding it very well. I may get you to say my favorite word in Australian at some point, which is the number that comes between 12 and 14. But
I'm just like that. I've never had someone want to ask me to say 13.
13. I love it. Anyway, no, what I wanted to tee up and ask Kate about is the extent to which, if you know, all this nastiness is actually affecting people's desire to run. Forget about to win, but to run for a moment, because we saw in our last election a very high proportion for us, the female candidates. So Drew and I served on 3 terms together, and the high point for women on our 15-member council was when there were 3, and in one of those councils there were 2. Now, this was not the case in the past. So before Drew was elected 20 years ago, we had, I don't think we ever had a majority female council, but almost. We had a lot of women in what was then, ironically, the alderman role. One of the first things I did when I became mayor, which Drew told me was a ridiculous empty gesture, but I'm still happy we did it, was we changed that name alderman to councillor. And for our efforts, we were rewarded with the smallest number of female candidates in the next election that we had seen in generations. And so clearly there's much more to it than that. But what I also think is interesting is in the 136-year history of Calgary, there were exactly 7 visibly non-white members of council. And in our last council together, Drew and I served with 4 non-white members out of 7. So 4 of them were at that time. And I think there are, Drew, do you know off the top of your head? 5 or 6 now. When I was first elected in 2010, I was the first non-white mayor of any large Canadian city. Now, of course, the cities of Calgary and Edmonton both have non-white mayors. There's a very good chance that the city of Vancouver will have a non-white mayor next week. So things have in some way shifted despite all the nastiness. And we're starting to get more candidates running. And I don't know if that's just a result of demographic change. I mean, 1 out of 3 Calgarians is not white now, so you're going to expect a larger group of people running, or if we're actually seeing anything in the data. You know, I think the question of how you win as a non-traditional candidate, I'd love to address it. I don't want to take up too much time. That's an interesting question because you have to have access to fundraising. You've got to have access to volunteers. You've got to have access to power and experience. Why did I say power? Experience in terms of running a campaign. That's a whole other story. But the real question for me is, are we seeing candidates, especially female and non-white candidates, decline because of the environment that's out there now? Sorry, I'll shut up now.
No, that's great. Thanks, Naheed. And before Kate, you respond, just to say that as is always the case with CityTalk, we have a very active chat community that are having lots of exchanges back and forth. Thanks, everybody. And a couple of people, including Alison Story, who I think is running for council in Chatham, is on the session today, and a couple of others. And so,
hi, Alison, you're running for council. That's awesome. Call me.
Exactly. So I think exactly. So I think we're creating a community of support here and a safe space for all of us. I hope to talk to one another back and forth about what are your experiences and how do we take steps to actually address them. So I hope people will continue to engage in the chat on this. And also I think there's some folks from AMO here and some academics who are also tracking what people are raising. So, and we always publish the chat just so people know that if you have a concern that you don't want something on the chat published, please get in touch with us and we'll make sure it isn't. But we always publish the chat because it's always so rich with resources and ideas and things. But if you don't want a section, let us know. Kate, can you reply now to the gang and particularly what Mayor Nenshi was raising?
Sure. So I think we should start by just calling it what it is. So we have a deep, long-standing problem in Canada where across orders of government and across rules, mayors, councillors, and so on, the vast majority of our elected officials have been older, white, straight, affluent men. Those 5 demographics, especially when together, have been so heavily overrepresented across all of these roles that they start to establish a norm of what we identify as being qualified to hold leadership. So anyone who doesn't fit that mold for any number of reasons has a worse experience when running and when holding elected office. And there's a growing and pretty healthy body of research on this. I see actually a few people who've produced this research are in the chat here. Studies on gender of female identified candidates, studies on racialized candidates, studies on Indigenous candidates, studies from candidates from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. They have a worse experience. They experience more online hate and vitriol. But the question about, is it discouraging people from running? It's a hard one to study. There are examples where people have gone out and asked, what do you think about running for office? And certainly the sort of mental health effect, the impact on family, loss of privacy, those things are well established. I think the trickier part of the onion to unpeel is the impact that watching elected officials who do not fit that prototype and the experience they have, the impact it has on confidence. We know there are big gaps in terms of whether, for example, those who identify as female and male consider themselves to be qualified for office because we've accepted that definition that qualification looks a certain way, instead of the way that it should be in politics, which is this is a representative group. So the diversity of your experience is what qualifies you to hold elected office. And, you know, I'll just one kind of broader point is I think our political system, we take representation very seriously, right? But the primary way we've defined this is geographic, right? How do we organize wards? How do we organize the Senate? How do we organize seats? So we've determined that geography is so important that we will set up a system that absolutely guarantees that we hear from geographically all parts of the country. But for some reason, we've been unwilling to make those same interventions to think about representation more broadly, like gender, like race, like age, like socioeconomic status, you know, like sexual orientation. These are things that I think increasingly, if we are to have legitimate governments that people can believe in, that actually hold to the promise of representing the people they serve, you know, it's great to do ask her campaigns and, you know, these interventions that I think will move the dial a little bit on getting underrepresented groups to step forward and run. But there are very intentional interventions that we could make that would fix this problem in a moment, right? Quotas is the big one. There's lots of examples around the world. There are things that we could do to just solve this problem. You know, you see lots of experimental sortition, for example, like there's lots of innovations happening to solve this representation problem. So I think in Canada, we both don't acknowledge that we fully have this problem. We think that it's sort of solved and it's getting better. And we point to these sort of anecdotal examples. And then we haven't really had a serious discussion about what we would do if we just wanted to solve this for once and for all. And it's not because there aren't ideas out there. I think it's because we have the political.
And what about the economics of it? I mean, lots of people, it feels like you have to be rich, have a second salary to be able to afford to be a municipal councillor if it's not going to pay you a proper salary so that it can be your full-time job. That's a pretty basic thing. You know, you can't afford to run. Okay, Drew's had her hand up. Go ahead, Drew.
Thank you. I think we were talking not about just who's running for office, but also who's voting in elections. And Ontario experienced one of the lowest voter turnouts. Is that going to be duplicated? I can't stress enough that cynicism people shut down. I think there should be a lot of study on why people stayed away from the Ontario election when it was so profoundly important. We all have a lesson to learn there. But people may be putting their names forward, but people are, the public is staying home, and there's a reason for it. And we should all be concerned about that. I want to push back on Tennille a little bit, because I think councils do have a role. And when you look at stepping stones for who runs for politics, it's often people who have been on boards and commissions for the municipality. And often when I first got elected, they were all male and they were all white. I was predominantly the only woman in the room when I was on a board or a commission as a new member of council. And people of color, I would say that would be even worse. That would be all older white men. And when we started looking at diversity for our boards and commissions and recognizing that diversity is representation, and that then we started to see different people running, because they were in the public eye and they had experience with public boards and commissions. Whose voices do councils amplify? That's incredibly important, because if we don't hear from those diverse communities in public hearings, then they remain silent and they feel powerless. So I think councils have a really important role in who they're inviting to the table and make room for them. So I'll just leave it at that.
That's a really good point. Yeah, it's totally, yeah, I understand what you're saying. We have committees as opposed to boards and commissions, and they're not really in the public eye all that much. So there's, it sounds like you have a lot more weightier tools to use to try and help make that happen. But it's certainly something that we've started, like this term of council, we've also kind of bringing in equity questions when it comes to committee representation and things like that. So you're right, these are very active discussions, but we need to keep pushing them.
And even community associations, and who has an elevated role and who has contact with members of council and elected individuals.
Go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, you know, there are a number of very practical things, as Drew is pointing out, that we need to do to encourage people, because people don't just run for office one morning. And so it's important to help folks feel part of their community, both through traditional structures and subverting the traditional structures, as Drew has pointed out, but also through just making people feel welcome in their communities. And so, I've been a bit excitedly energetic this morning because I want people to be excited about running in elections and voting in elections, but there's some very serious issues here. So Drew highlights something that a lot of people are not brave enough to say, which is a lot of this division didn't just happen. It is by design. And it's a very deliberate design. And the design is, and I apologize if this makes me look like I should be wearing a tinfoil hat, but we know what's happening. And it's extremely cynical. And it has to do with elevating the voice of people who in the past have not been voters. And it's turning those people into voters. And so starting in about 2015 with Cambridge Analytica and with Brexit, what we saw was a very deliberate attempt to get people who we might define as dividers and haters, for lack of a better term. Drew would just straight up call them racists, who never really voted before. And so we're never a fruitful target for political parties to go after. And through various mechanisms, these groups have been radicalized, but they've also become very solid voters. So you have Pierre Poilievre, who knows that much of his message only appeals to 20–25% of the population, but he knows that 20–25% will vote. So there's no incentive for him to be able to appeal to everyone else. The perverse other part of this is that someone's calling it anger farming in the chat, that kind of attitude turns off everyone else. So it's got a double benefit. It gets the dividers to vote, and it turns off the non-dividers and gets them to not vote. And so you end up in a situation, and I don't claim to know anything about Ontario provincial politics, but you end up in a situation where you have a very low voter turnout, but the people who are voting are different demographically than they were before. So, every political party, every candidate has always pandered to seniors because seniors vote. And now what we're seeing is a lot of these dividers are voting in the same number as seniors are voting. So this isn't accidental. This sort of radicalization is very deliberate and very designed. So in the 2017 election, when I was running for mayor, what we found was a lot of these tools were being experimented on against us. Fundamentally, a bunch of Canadians had gone down in the 2016 Trump election and learned from Cambridge Analytica and others how to use this with the deliberate intent of unseating Rachel Notley in Alberta, Kathleen Wynne in Ontario, and the Prime Minister. And they succeeded in 2 out of 3, though one would argue that those 2 probably would have lost anyway. But nonetheless, this was done deliberately. And because our municipal election happened to be before those elections, getting rid of that Muslim guy in Calgary was an opportunity to test this stuff out. So we tried to do the opposite. We tried to use the same, Drew probably doesn't even know this, but we tried to use the same tools that were being used to radicalize one segment of society to radicalize a more thoughtful segment of society, particularly women, and get them to vote. And we had some success in doing that. But we are not nearly as well organized as the others. We aren't nearly as far along the path in order to be able to do that. So I think that's the important thing to remember. It's not that suddenly people are more nasty. Those people have always been nasty. It's just suddenly they've been given the permission to be able to do what Alison Story says she faced when she ran for mayor. And this is where our real challenge is. And I spent a lot of my time thinking about how we counteract that. Part of it is we use their tools against them. But part of it is we really just have to appeal to people to understand what is at stake here and what happens when you stay home and what happens when you don't encourage other people to run, what happens when you don't donate money. And To me, I only have one or two solutions to every problem. But one of my solutions to this problem is the concept of community service, what I call seva, Sanskrit word that means service. So I launched a program some years ago that I took from the mayor's office with me. Literally, it's only a big foam number 3 and it's in my basement, but it's called 3 Things for Canada. And it just simply encourages every citizen to do 3 acts of community service every year, at least 3 acts, whether it's shovel your neighbor's walk or join the board of your local community association. Because what I believe is not that voters are active citizens, but I believe that active citizens vote. So a lot of people, a lot of philosophy has been, if you just get people to vote, they'll get more involved in their community. I actually think it's the other way around. If you figure out ways to create social ties between people, if you find ways to create community service, then you are building up that social capital, which results in people voting and running for office. And I can't see the whole chat, but I saw someone start. It's interesting that the right wing has used, and this is the key. What folks on the far, I don't like using right and left, but what folks on the divider side have done is they have very paradoxically used the tools of creating social capital to create social capital among people who want to divide, who want to watch things burn. And so, again, I'm pontificating. Mary knows I do that, but she invites me anyway. One of the things that we really saw during the convoy protests and so on, look, if you're someone like Drew Farrell or Kate Graham, you've been to lots of protests in your life. And when you go to these protests, you always know that you're taking a personal risk, that not everyone will agree with you, that you could get beat up, that you could get arrested, that you could get beat up by the police if you're a person of color. But you do it anyway because it's important to you. And what happened in all these anti-vaccination, et cetera, protests was we removed that element of risk because it became a party. That's why you had hot tubs on Parliament Hill. The people on Saturdays marching through the Beltline in downtown Calgary were doing so because of philosophy, but also because it was fun. That's when they saw their friends, and they were doing so with no risk whatsoever. And this is actually a fundamental shift, that we created social capital in a dangerous way because we didn't know how to respond to it. The people of the Beltline in downtown Calgary finally started swearing at folks and counter protesting, and then they went away pretty quick. It was no fun anymore.
Can I steer us back?
This is what we have to figure out, how to build that social capital up again. I'll stop. Sorry.
I want to steer us back to then. How do you, if social capital is what we're after, which I'm sure it is, and I see your hands up, Tennille. So but I want to just, for the remaining time we've got on the call, I'd like us to have a bit of a tough conversation, if we could, about part of what contributes to cynicism about municipal politics. And I don't know whether this affects people's decisions to run or not. But what I am interested in, when you counsel somebody who's running again, or is running for the first time in the next 4 or 5 years, what do you think they can accomplish? I think many of us are tired of municipal councils contributing to NIMBY. And I'm wondering if there's a way for you as veterans to encourage, if we want the electorate to take municipal leadership seriously, then I think we've got to find a way to demonstrate municipal officials taking, bold stands on problems that are facing us. And NIMBY is one of the ones that drives a lot of people crazy. So does anybody want to step in on that and say, yes, okay, Tennille, over to you.
I will jump in on this one. I think part of it stems from the fact that a lot of people don't actually know what council does. I think this will be an entire different discussion, and it's maybe the journalist in me, but the breakdown in local media is having a very direct impact in local democracy, because people only see their social media feeds. So they're not actually seeing the other side of political debates. They don't actually believe there is another side sometimes. So so I think that's fueling the cynicism, is people only see their reality, and then municipal councils, they have to deal with nuance. They have to deal with grey. We have to do the best for everyone. But it's funny you mentioned, how do we get councils to take bold stands and provide leadership? That's what we did, this council. And it's being turned against us in some ways in this campaign. So the city of Waterloo, as with every city residential roads are a key issue, residential road safety and speeds. So, hello, Calgary. We set a new residential speed limit at 30 kilometers an hour.
Good for you.
Yeah, it was bold. It's not super common in Ontario. It has been done, but it's not common yet. The research supports this move, and my ward was begging for it. So for Ward 7 Uptown, people were basically like, go as low as you can. But the local media and some other people active on social platforms have basically reignited this as an election issue. And we're seeing people running against this, despite the science supporting it, despite the fact that it's an essential key to meeting our climate goals, to meeting our neighborhood goals, despite everything that's going for it, there's this reactionary populist backlash.
And you can imagine if a council took a similar approach, let's say on inclusionary zoning, and said, okay, that's it, everybody. Inclusionary zoning is across, if it had the jurisdiction, across all parts of the city. You could imagine a similar kind of pushback, which I'm sure both Naheed and Drew can comment on in terms of their efforts to try to get neighborhoods to accept more density. So there's the dilemma. We want the broader electorate to understand how critical your role is, why you're so important to their quality of life. But when a council goes and does something brave, they get punished.
I think we need to become our own storytellers.
Okay.
We need to tell this story so well that we're bringing people along with us. But the challenge is, how do we reach them? How do we get them? How do we help people break down their own silos to be able to see the full picture? This is a big challenge.
We're making this job even more important than it already was. Okay, Kate, go for it. Respond there.
I don't want to be so negative and like, I think it's a way deeper problem than that. Like, I agree. I think those would all be positive steps forward, but you know, we talked a few times about the Ontario election that just passed. Really low. I was a candidate in that election. A door knock that will stick with me was a polling vote on election day, and there was a woman and she had my sign on her lawn. I'd been at her door 3 times already. The polling station was across the street, and I said, there's 45 minutes left, can you please go and vote? And she was like, you know, it's been a long day. And I'm like, I've been out for 16 hours a day as a volunteer for months, and it's not worthy enough to walk across the street. And it's not a criticism of her, right? Like, people don't believe that this matters. They've lost faith that this is important. They feel powerless. They don't think that it matters. And when you think, like, if we were treating the population like a human body, this would be a symptom, not the disease, right? Population well-being, one of the indicators is like high engagement, democracy, a sort of sense of collectivism, a willingness to come together. And I do think there's these big concerning things that we're retreating to the individual. People feel under threat and under attack. There are these deep problems that manifest in, I just can't walk across the street.
So Kate,
it's a deep problem. It's not.
I appreciate this, and I appreciate the level of sophistication you bring to it. But if we're trying to be an antidote to people feeling overwhelmed, hopeless, helpless, all the post-pandemic stuff that people are reporting, my instinct is always go as local as you possibly can.
I agree.
And the idea that Naheed has about 3 things for Canada, is it 3 things for your neighborhood? Do we create a situation where people are reminded about how they can make a difference out their own doorstep, and then somehow they make common cause with the person that's running locally? I'm wondering what Drew.
I think
go ahead.
If I could just, I think this is the real promise and what's exciting about local politics, whether it is closer to people or not. When people feel powerless, right? Like, politics can't be about concentrating power. It should be about giving power. People have more power than they think that they do. And finding ways to fuel that and using the closest level that we have to be transformative and different. I do think that's our best hope.
So one big idea, of course, would be if the government of Canada and the provincial governments gave more money to municipalities, and then you were seen to have more power. Just saying, if they thought the stakes were higher. Drew, do you want to comment on this? Do you want to jump in?
I do, because I made some bold moves, a lot of them, while I was on council, and I was always prepared to lose the election. But I think that my constituents, and I never suffered from low voter turnout. They were always hotly contested elections, but I always shared a vision and articulated a vision that was authentic, and that and I left breadcrumbs so people understood why I was making these seemingly controversial
That's interesting.
decisions at the time. And so always explaining and sharing and having conversations of, one of the reasons I've been so radicalized is there's this sense of community there. There's a sense of belonging.
Which is the point ahead meant. It became a party, right?
It became a party, but also a sense of belonging. And
Yeah.
we're losing that partly because how we're building our cities. But if you can, over your term, if you're running for re-election, and as you're building up a constituency you run the first time, to build a sense of belonging and show where people fit in. And it is constantly finding better ways to communicate. And I think politicians and bureaucracies are terrible at communicating complex ideas. They can be boiled down to really simple things. And so I can't stress that enough. I can't give you any easy steps, but there are ways to inspire people. And that's our job as decision makers, is to find ways to inspire people that there is a better way. There's a way to improve people's lives. And it's not just about you, it's about our society and why we're stronger together. I think that's incredibly important. We're losing that as a society. We need to get it back.
Interesting, to Neil's call that we have to become our own, you have to become your own storytellers. You're a
Exactly.
journalist, to Neil, so we're hoping, is that giving us a clue as to what you're going to double down on once you're released from the shackles of the Waterloo Council?
Oh gosh, I have 9-year-old twins, so I think they get dibs on deciding what comes next.
I get it. I totally get it. If you were to, I mean, and you've got several candidates, potential councillors on this live session, and then the other people will watch it. As you guys know, we get much more traffic of people watching these things subsequently. If there is one thing that you would encourage people that are seeking elected office and may or may not be successful, even the ones that win, but also the ones that lose, is there a particular call out you want to make for the next term, the next 4 years of municipal leadership in the country? Now, had you first and then Kate Graham.
I think the real call out is, first of all, to those of you who are running, way to go. Congratulations. I hope that you are all super successful, because you're obviously nerdy enough to be on this call, but get off this call and get to the doors. That's a great thing. And as we've heard from these wonderful panelists today, and what an honor to be here with all of them, the critical thing is just to appeal to people's vision for how a community can be better. Even when I got down and dirty and bare knuckled, I never departed from that basic concept that we can all agree, regardless of where we stand, we can all agree on a few basic things. If you work hard, you deserve to have a better life. The community needs to work for everyone. And we should all invest in transit, and some more very, very specific things like that. Transit, always a winner, for example, right, left, young, old, doesn't matter, always a winner. And so these are the sorts of things where if you can stay above the fray, you'll notice that's where you get. And on the speed limits, Tennille, I'll just say, very interestingly, in the 2017 election, a lot of the candidates ran supporting 30 kilometers an hour speed limits. So in our very first meeting as a new council, we went around the table and said, what are you guys interested in? And that came up, and I said, let's do that and let's get it done quickly. And it ended up taking 3 years, Drew. And we ended up at 40 kilometers instead of 30 kilometers. And everyone thought it was super controversial. I did not hear one person talk about it in the 2017 election. It's done, it's dusted, people see the benefits and they're moving forward, and we'll see if the new council tries to go from 40 to 30. But if you make the decisions and get them done, even inclusionary zoning, people aren't going to go back and try and unwind them. So just be brave and do it, just like Drew does, and get her done.
And I think the important thing is that, it may take years. Remember, like it takes a few go rounds and then you look back and realize it happened. Quick words to Kate, Drew, and then to Neil. Going forward, what would should the focus be, Kate? Over to you, then Drew, then to Neil.
Sure. So I'll repeat the point that I think, politics should be about giving people power. So thank you for running. And if you are lucky enough to be successful, use that position to give voice to those, especially who you hear from the least. acknowledge the inequities around you, and be willing to take a hard stance, even when it's not popular. To me, the three big problems in the world right now are climate change, inequality in all forms, and our weakening democracy. So none of those are popular issues to take on, and they all require political courage, and they all require listening, not just to the loudest voices, but to those who need government the most.
Drew.
Well, I could talk for another hour, but this is such an important topic. People need to see themselves reflected back in decision-making. And so how you describe the work that you do, personalize it so that the average person can see why it matters to them. And that goes back to what Tennille said about storytelling. It can't be overemphasized how important it is to communicate why it matters to an individual who's busy just struggling with life.
Just getting through their days. Yeah, I hear you. Last word to you, Tennille.
Okay, first of all, if you're running, thank you. It's a hugely vital part of democracy, and it will make you a better voter in the future. For issues like, honestly, climate change, it's where it's at. The clock is ticking. This is not a drill. So that's got to be front and foremost. And if you're lucky enough to get one of these seats, enjoy it. Don't take it like it's going to be a lot, but it's a huge privilege. And ultimately, it's not about you. Someone else will be in that seat one day. So just while you are in it, try and build the best future you can so that when you do step away one day, you can step away proud.
Excellent.
Honestly, you guys are all great. And to all the city talkers who are in the chat and listening, you know, let's curb our inner cynic, our inner skeptic, and appreciate the leadership that these kinds of folks have been providing in elected office, or almost in elective office in Kate's case, and the kind of encouragement they're offering to the people on this chat, but others who are willing to put their names on the line, on the ballot, and we'll all turn out. And it's all part of building a stronger Canada, is having stronger local representation, so that, as Kate suggested, the power is more equitably shared, and that we can actually affect how our cities work for everyone. So thanks everybody for joining on City Talk. Great to meet you, Tennille, and good luck on whatever's next.
Likewise.
Thank you, Drew. Nice to see you again. Mayor Nenshi, always great to have you on City Talk. And Kate, we always appreciate the perspectives you bring. Thanks everybody for joining us. It will be posted online in the next couple of days. And don't forget, get out and vote.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.